Hello everybody, AZ Flyer here, and in this video we're going to talk about flight modes. Now flight modes isn't something that every flyer uses, and you can go through an entire RC career and never use this, but there's some things that you're going to want to do that are going to require having flight modes set up. So it's really good that we talk about this before we get into some more advanced settings. So let's talk about flight modes. And what flight modes is, it's the ability to have different trim settings for different flying configurations of your airplane. The most common is something like maybe you put your flaps down and you need to trim it again because your flaps came down. So rather than having to trim it every time you put your flaps up and down, you would just have your flight mode change tied to your flap switch. That's a very common thing. Another is if you fly something like an F-14 that has a variable sweep wing, you put the wings back and it might need a total new trim configuration than it had when the wings are forward. There's another example. You're going to want to tie your flight modes to your wing sweep switch. So that's what flight modes are typically used for. So let's talk about how we set up flight modes in the most basic configuration. And so here we go. Okay, so to start out with, we're going to tap on our trims window here, our little trims button, and open that up. And there's a couple things in here that if you haven't paid attention to trims yet, you're going to want to do here. One is the step. This is how much trim you get for each time you click your trim switch. I've found fine to be way too fine. I mean, I have to like hit 100 clicks to get to do anything. So I would recommend turning those up to about medium to get a good effect. And then you'll see here there's something that says independent trim per flight mode. You're going to want to turn that on if indeed you want the trim to be different for this control surface as you change your flight mode. So if you've got an airplane with a rudder, for instance, we may want that. We may want to turn that on. You may never do your rudder trim change, but it's good to know that if I did a rudder trim change, as I change my flight mode, it's going to affect the rudder. So we're going to want to turn that on. Elevator is something you're going to see very common. So we're going to turn that to medium. Let's go ahead and have our trim set to medium there. We're going to turn that on because we want the trim to be different for each flight mode of the elevator. Throttle, we're going to leave that alone. Not going to touch that. Aileron, this is the one you're probably going to see the most often. We're going to turn it to medium. And we're going to turn that on. So what that's going to mean is that as I flip the switch that's going to change my flight mode, I'll need to retrim it as a result of flipping that switch. So be aware of that. So since we set this independent trim to flight mode on, if I trim my airplane out with the flaps up, then I put my flaps down, that trim that I did for flaps up is going to go away, and I'm going to go back to neutral. So I'm going to need to retrim it when I hit that switch. If for any reason you do not want that to happen, if you don't want the trim to change when you hit your flight mode switch, then you're going to want to turn this off. But in the case of something like flapper-ons or a wing sweep or something like that, you're going to see a significant change in trim. So that's why you want to have this on. Okay, so once we've decided and set up our trims, we're going to go to flight modes. Tap on the flight modes button, and you're going to see you probably have something that looks like this. It's a default flight mode. We're going to want to set up a flight mode on a different set up our different flight modes. So I'm going to tie it to my flap switch, and that's this switch right here at the top. I'm going to tie it up to a flap switch. That way when I drop my flaps, it's going to change the flight mode. So we're going to go ahead and add a flight mode by hitting the plus sign, and I'm going to call this flaps up, because this is the flight mode I want for when I have my flaps all the way retracted. My active condition is going to be my flap switch. So I'm going to pull that all the way up, and you'll see I have flaps up is what it just told me. So now this flight mode is tied to my flap switch being all the way up. And you can tell it's working because it's bold right now. If I move my flaps down, it will unbold. So as I go to flaps half, it unbolds. So I go to flaps up, then it bolds. I know it's working. Now, if I want this to have some kind of a fade in or out, then I'm going to go ahead and put I want it to go slowly. Like say I'm tying my flaps, and my flaps are on a 2-second deployment. I'm probably going to want a 2-second deployment on this flight mode as well. So I'm going to go ahead and tile this up to 2 seconds, or I'll say 1.5 seconds. I'm not sure what my flaps are set at. Say 1.5 seconds. And the same thing with fading out. I want it to fade out slowly, not be a harsh switch of trim. So in this case, I've got and I'll verify on my flaps what my speed is, but I want this flight mode to match that speed so that it transitions my trim as my configuration trims or changes. All right, so we'll come back up. We're going to add a flight mode for flaps half, and I'll put flaps half. Here's my title. My active condition is going to be my flaps half button. So now I know that that's tied to that. I can tell as I flip flaps up, it unbolds. I go to flaps half, it's bolded. Same thing here. I'm going to give it about a second. All right, so now I'm set there. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to add full flaps. So again, I'm going to call this flaps full. All right, and I'm going to tie this to my flaps down switch.
Flaps down.
There you go. Now I've got flaps down. I can verify it's working.
Half. Flaps down.
And I'm going to set this again for about a second. Again, the timing is totally how you feel it comfortable. What you don't want is you don't want your airplane changing a configuration, like wings sweeping slowly, but or your flaps go down slowly, but your flight mode trim changes harshly. So you want to make sure those two things are aligned so that your flight mode trim changes as your configuration changes. Okay, now, so the way we can test this is we can try some different trim changes with our changes of our configuration of our flaps. So you'll see we've got our trim monitors down here below, and you can see they're working by me moving the trim. So let's leave everything neutral. Let's leave everything neutral for flaps up. I'll go to half flaps.
Flaps half.
And I'll put in a bunch of left aileron and a bunch of up elevator. And let's see what happens. If I go back to flaps neutral again,
flaps up.
You see my trims go away. So I can tell that my flight mode is working. If I go to full flaps, you'll see that the trim went away there too. So let's go ahead and go to a bunch of opposite elevator and a bunch of opposite aileron. Aileron and elevator. See what happens. If I go back to neutral now,
flaps half.
You can see my trims changed.
Flaps up.
And they changed again. So my flight modes are working. So now I know that as I change configuration of my airplane with flaps going up and down, that my trim would change accordingly. So that's what flight modes are used for. It's for things where if you see a significant change of trim needed when you change the configuration, like dropping flaps, wing sweep, or something like that. I've normally not had to do this with a normal configured airplane with ailerons and flaps, but you'll see in a future video, we're going to do something on flaperons and flying ailerons in your tail and elevons in your tail. And when you do that, you're going to see a significant trim change probably being needed. So that's why you're going to want to have your flight mode set up before you do something like that. So I hope this video is helpful for you. Hit a like if you would, please, and subscribe. Leave a comment if you have one. And we appreciate you watching. Be safe flying, and see you next time.